Very often children are incapable of being able to hold together two conflicting thoughts. Now, in psychological terms, splitting is a perfectly normal developmental thing to do. So very small infants, when they're confronted with a world that's full of very different sensations that feel overwhelming, will begin to split those different sensations into good sensations and bad sensations. And even more than that, what they'll do is they will split people into two parts. So Melanie Klein talks about the infant who is unable to be able to reconcile the fact that mother who is present and nurturing is also the same mother who is absent and therefore persecutory. And in its early developmental stages, the child will conceptualize the mother as being two separate objects, the good mother and the bad mother. But over time begins to learn how to integrate that and find ambivalence so that the mother is a single figure that contains both bad and good. Now, in cases where alienation takes hold in a child, the child returns to that pathological splitting, and what they're effectively doing is splitting part of themselves. They feel compelled to reject one of their parents by a parent who is applying pressure to them, and of course that's the most unnatural thing for them to do. You end up with one parent being the embodiment of everything that's good and the other parent of being everything that is bad. But that really is a projection of the child's inner fragmented self. The first thing is to understand the severity of the splitting reaction in children. And that's something that you have to spend a little bit of time working out, because children can appear to be very, very split and very hostile. So I'll meet a child quite often who will be vehement in their rejection of a parent. However, part of our assessment process is always to see the child in clinical observation with the parent that they're rejecting. And sometimes I can see a child who on the surface is very, very hostile to a parent, but when you bring them into the company of the parent that they've been rejecting, very quickly you see that actually that connection can be picked up again and the child becomes far less split. But the critical thing is that to recognise this as being an attachment disruption. So typically children will form a very strong attachment to both of their carers. The parents don't have to do anything special for the child to attach to them. It's an evolutionary imperative for the child to do this. And the child will be uniquely attached to both mum and dad. But when the family separates, the child is confronted with the task of trying to work out how to maintain a relationship, an attachment relationship with both mum and with dad. Now, in certain circumstances, that's not possible for the child, and therefore you see the alienation, you see the splitting, and the child severs the relationship with one of their parents. And what's happening is that the child is responding to a psychopathology within the aligned parent. So a parent who threatens to cut off the child's attachment with the other parent simply by signalling that they're unhappy with it. A parent who perhaps psychologically decompensates every time the child is due to leave them to go to the other parent. Those are the kind of pressures that cause a child in the interpsychic world between the aligned parent and the child to cut off that relationship. Because actually the rejection is simply a kind of a projection of the pathological alignment, and that's what we're looking for. Why has this child become bound to one parent? In every parental alienation case, what you have at the heart of it is an imbalance in power. There is an asymmetrical power relationship between the parents. One parent has the power over the other and has the power over the child. You're looking at the power dynamics because they're very much at the root of it. What we typically find is that these kind of fractures and the dynamics that cause the alignment have been present in the family very often for a long time, since the child was born. You have a child who's been brought up in the shadow of the aligned parents' difficult behaviours, sometimes quite pathological behaviours, and they grow extraordinarily sensitive emotional antennae, so they're always scanning the horizon to work out what kind of behaviour is acceptable and what kind of behaviour isn't acceptable. And if you've got a parent who demonstrates, who shows, who through their behaviour signals to the child that it's not acceptable for the child to have a relationship with the other parent, then the child will respond to that, because their greatest anxiety is that that parent will become emotionally unavailable to them. They will be ostracised by that parent. And the parent in those circumstances has got the power over the child, and through that the power over the other parent. If you don't treat a child that's been alienated, a child who's been pathologically split, the real danger for that child is that they will go through the rest of their lives with a propensity to split, by which I mean that all of their life will be one of black and white rather than shades of grey. Now, we see this very often when we work with adult children who were alienated. Those are children who very often don't trust their own judgment. They find it very difficult to have relationships that are stable with other people because they don't trust the other person and they don't trust themselves. I think if I was to design a system that would deal with this problem in the way that I think it should be, it would be one that recognised that any child that is either resisting or rejecting an attachment relationship with one of their parents is a child who is demonstrating that there is a very, very serious problem. These cases wouldn't be treated as custody and visitation cases, they'd be treated as child protection cases, because what we know is when a child is beginning to reject a relationship with an attachment figure, there is something very serious at the heart of this, and that it needs to be dealt with very swiftly. We don't have, or the child doesn't have the time for this to be spun out over many, many years of going back to court and trying to resolve it through parents being told they need to get along better, mediation and all those kinds of things. I think what you need is you need a thorough investigation into what's going on as early as possible in the case, and then the proper remedial action taken. Either the behaviours of the aligned parent are constrained, but if that's not possible, then the child needs to be removed from the source of the harm, just in exactly the same way that we would do if a child was being physically harmed or sexually abused or neglected. We look at this at the Family Separation Clinic first and foremost as a child protection issue. Parental alienation, in my view, is child abuse. Sometimes it's child abuse that's inadvertent. A parent is simply incapable of holding back their own psychopathology. Very often these are transgenerational transmissions of trauma that come crashing out in the here and now. But whether this is deliberate and conscious or whether it's unconscious, the child is still at risk of the same kinds of harm, and therefore we need to think of it in terms of it as child abuse and child protection. Somebody has power over the other, and the first thing that you need to do is to neutralise that power, and the only way that you can do that successfully is to bring in a court intervention that stops that parent doing what they're doing. So what you're doing is you are using the legal framework to put in place the conditions that allow you then to begin to do the therapeutic work. If you attempt to do this work as a therapist without having that framework in place, then not only is it unlikely to work, but you're actually likely to make it a whole lot worse for the child. And therefore it's critical that you get the case management right and you bring the legal constraint in, and then you do the therapeutic work within that space. In other cases, we work with parents for whom they are very much a victim of their own history. So an example of that would be perhaps a mother who had been sexually abused in her own childhood. And because that was never dealt with, it's remained unresolved. And in the drama of the family separation, that can come spilling out into the here and now. And typically what happens there is that they will project their unresolved trauma onto the child and almost believe that the child is being abused themselves. And what that does in psychological terms is it allows that parent then to go and rescue their own inner child. Typically, therefore, the other parent who becomes the rejected parent is simply a kind of an innocent bystander, if you like. But in those cases, it's difficult to describe that behaviour as being deliberate. This is something that needs to be stopped, it needs to be prevented, not least because if it's not, the danger is that it gets passed down the generation to that child's own children and even beyond that. And as a therapist, I feel some sense of compassion for those people. And part of the work that we do is really to sort of help those parents to be directed off to get their own therapy so that they can perhaps move forward in a more congruent and healthier way. For them, it's the most unnatural thing for them to do is to reject one of their parents, so they have to push it down out of sight. But it doesn't go away. The attachment relationship is an indelible relationship between the child and the parent. And therefore, as a therapist, the work that you're doing is to create the conditions in which the child's authentic self can re-emerge, but also helping the formerly rejected parent to reconnect and to provide the conditions for the child. What we're talking about when a child suppresses that attachment relationship is their gaze, their attachment gaze, as we call it, drops. And the same thing happens for the parent. So for the parent to be able to stand what happens to them, their attachment gaze drops as well because it's too painful for them. And so what you're doing as a therapist is helping both the child and the formerly rejected parent to lift that attachment gaze, and when the two connect again, that's when the magic happens. And what you see then is a very, very rapid change in the child's presentation. I think one of the biggest problems that alienated parents have is that they lose touch with their own innate sense of having been a parent. You know, we parent quite unconditionally, we just do it. And when you become alienated, then I think that what happens is that not only does everybody else question how good a parent you are, but you too begin to question your own right to parent. And so when I'm working with parents who've been rejected, what I do to help them is to first of all get back in touch with their inner parent. But it's also important for them to really live as full a life as they can. They need to be healthy in as many dimensions as possible. They need to be physically healthy, psychologically healthy, emotionally healthy, and spiritually healthy. They have to retain the whole of who they are because that's who the child needs to reattach to. So the healthier the parent can be, not only is that better for them as they live their life, but equally it provides the platform against which the child can then properly reconnect. Adult children also need to know that when they come home, which is how we describe a reconnection, when they come home that the parent that they've been estranged from, the parent that they've rejected, will be as whole and healthy as possible. You see, one of the difficulties that children of all ages face when they've been alienated is the guilt and the shame that they feel for having done that. And one of the things that's critical for parents who've been alienated is to be able to have dealt with things so that they can simply welcome the child back into their lives. But I think one of the important things to think about is not that we kind of educate the child about parental alienation. You were alienated, this is what happened to you. Sure, that the child at some point may well have questions about what happened in the past, and you can begin to engage the child or the adult child in kind of critical thinking. But first and foremost, in my belief, the child simply needs to know that there will be a safe place for them to return to. That a part of them remains disconnected, a part of them remains split off. The child is almost alienated from a part of themselves. So even where there is a reconnection between the child and the formerly rejected parent, the child can still feel a sense of incongruence, and there still can be difficulties in that relationship. And in those cases, very often what can be the most useful is to get some professional help from somebody who knows how to do that work, how to deal with trauma and the associated kind of difficulties that produces.